So Dr. Evan Ward obtained a Bachelor of Art from Brigham Young University. He then went on to get a master's and a PhD in history from the University of Georgia. He came to teach at BYU in 2009. He's fluent in Spanish, but can also speak Portuguese and French. He's been an associate chair of the Department of History since 2017 at Brigham Young University. His current research interests are driven by a question of learning and travel. That is how he came to the Blanchett Rockefeller Project. He was doing research on her and her husband's work promoting Asia and the United States and took note of her significant role in that endeavor. Though her husband received the majority of the credit for their joint efforts. Now Walden is going to tell us more.
After receiving a Women's Research Initiative grant in 2017, Dr. Ward began his work on the biography of Rockefeller, and in 2018, his report entitled Blanchett Hooker Rockefeller Muse of the Museum of Modern Art was published by the Rockefeller Archive Center. Dr. Ward has been recognized for his excellence in teaching and scholarship on numerous accounts, and most recently received the award of Outstanding Teacher of the Year from the Department of History at BYU in 2011. He became an honorary member of the Phi Lambda Beta, Portuguese National Honor Society in 2016, and received the Alcuin Fellowship from BYU General Education Honors Program in 2018. The list of his published works is long and includes but is certainly not limited to Before Dubai, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation in Iranian Tourism Development, 1967 to 1969, in the Journal of Tourism History, Hidden in Plain Sight, Tourism Planning, Afro-Colombian Society and Community in Peru, Colombia, published in the journal Humanities, and in 2018, the guest opinion, We Need International Infrastructure in the Deseret News. His presentation today is called Matron of the Modern, The Life of Blanchett Rockefeller. Please don't be shy in unmuting your mics and joining me in giving him a warm welcome, Dr. Evan Ward.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be with you and to make this presentation about Blanchett Rockefeller. Our presentation today is dedicated to Moira Kennedy O'Malley, the late wife of Blanchett's nephew, Cormac O'Malley, who coined the title for today's presentation and graciously hosted me with my research in late 2017. The role of women in the Museum of Modern Art has been a vital one from the day the idea was first conceived, observed David Rockefeller to a small gathering in the newly dedicated gallery on the recently expanded third floor of New York's Museum of Modern Art on December 7th, 1987. And we are here today to give thanks and praise to an amazing and dedicated lady who, since she became president of the museum for a second time in 1972, has probably had a greater impact on the evolution of MoMA, both internally and externally, than any other one individual, close quote. The setting, in fact, was the dedication of a gallery designated for abstract expressionist art, in whose honor the space was named, Blanchett H. Rockefeller. 30 years after that ceremony, thousands of patrons continue to mill through the delicately lit space, some soothed by the muted cardinal color of an outsized Barnett Newman canvas, as you can see on screen, others stirred by a Jackson Pollock oeuvre, most unaware of the singular influence of the gallery's namesake on the museum's history itself. Born to Blanche and Elon Hooker in 1909 in New York City, Blanchett Ferry Hooker Rockefeller followed a path typical of daughters of newly minted industrial titans at the turn of the century, but one that prepared her for unique service in the world of art. Her father, Elon Hooker, a Cornell University PhD in civil engineering, founded Hooker Electrochemical. Hooker's educational and professional pursuits made possible his marriage to the former Blanche Ferry, daughter of Dexter Ferry Sr., a city father of modern Detroit and patron of the Detroit Institute of Arts. The marriage of Ferry's penchant for art and Hooker's business acumen bequeathed an enviable legacy to the 4 Hooker daughters, including Blanchette. What was said of John and Abigail Adams' children might also have been rendered by Mr. Hooker with a difference. I must study politics and business that my daughters may have liberty to study painting and poetry, mathematics, and philosophy. The youngest of the daughters, Blanchette, attended Vassar College, serving as class president before hitting it off over tennis and horse riding with John D. Rockefeller III in 1931, less than a year before their Riverside Church wedding on November 19, 1932. She spent the ensuing years raising 4 children and volunteering in various capacities in greater New York City, including at the Museum of Modern Art, where she served as president on 2 occasions from 1959 to 1962, as well as from 1972 to 1985. Blanchette played down the significance of her work at MoMA, for which in 1985 the White House bestowed a Presidential Recognition Award. She deflected attention from the decade-long fundraising campaign that effectively doubled in size the MoMA's exhibition space, as well as provided for an adjoining residential tower, bedizened with its own objets d'art, that generated income for operating expenses and later acquisitions. One thing I want you to be very clear about is not to exaggerate my role in the museum, she cautioned David Hoffman in a 1986 interview. Quote, "There seems to be some feeling that I have done something that nobody else has done, and the reason is that I got into all this after my children were grown up and my husband was very occupied. And I keep getting upset and people keep saying that nothing would have happened if I had not been there. This is absolutely not true. The key thing that I have been able to do is to be consistent, to go to meetings and to know what is going on," close quote. Her MoMA peers, however, sided with brother-in-law David's appraisal given above. Cesar Pelli, consulting architect, noted, quote, "Blanchette was the hero of this whole process as far as I'm concerned. She was wonderful getting the building built." MoMA director Richard Oldenburg's assessment surpassed that of Pelli. He cited her as one of only 2 trustees visionary enough to grasp the possibilities of the innovative expansion plan. Quote, "Blanchette, of course, was such a spectacularly marvelous person," he noted. "She was not only marvelously nice and approachable and friendly to everyone, all that we know, but people underestimated the real intelligence and sensitivity that she had. She was one of the best judges of people I have encountered, and she could case someone very, very fast as to whether she thought they were really to be trusted or to be furthered along. But she was never antagonistic to anyone. She really had a good sense of this, whether it was in case of hiring people or considering trustees or of approaching donors and so forth," close quote. Architect Pelli concurred, although more succinctly. Blanchette, he revealed in his MoMA oral history, was much savvier than she allowed. If modest about her contributions, Blanchette left no doubt as to the source of her character and talents. At her memorial service in 1992, son John J. D Rockefeller IV recalled, quote, "As she would point out, my mother was not a Rockefeller. She was born Blanchette Ferry Hooker, and she was enormously proud of the Hooker family and her mother's Ferry family from Detroit," close quote. For the biographer, this attribution underscores one of the challenges of assessing Blanchette's legacy. To wit, writing a biography of one of the Rockefeller wives demands a careful balance of understanding the impact of Blanchette's own formative experience, as well as how the Rockefeller family shaped her contributions to society. As attested by Frederick Edwin Church's glowing tableau of Reverend Thomas Hooker's entrance to the Connecticut wilds, as you can see here. Blanchette's forebears played prominent roles in the founding of Hartford, Connecticut, as well as the development of upstate New York. The Ferry family traced their ancestors back to 16th century France, where Huguenot Charles Ferry fled the country in 1586 to England, from whence his posterity made their way to the United States. Rochester, with its picturesque falls and bustling river trade, was a crossroads for both families. From that hive of 19th century industry, a young Dexter Ferry Sr. left to seek his fortune as a bookseller in Detroit, where he invested in a burgeoning seed company on the side. At the same time, Horace Hooker and Sarah Pamela Hooker returned to the Rochester area following the Civil War. Sarah Hooker, the daughter of Elon Huntington, a trustee of the University of Rochester, perpetuated the family's interest in education, writing and lecturing extensively on the region's history throughout her life. Primary accounts of the family begin with a flourish of letters from Blanchette's parents, Elon and Blanche. There are small glints of the star-crossed encounter between the two at the Vatican and in Rome in March of 1895, while Blanche was touring the country with her mother and Elon studying on the continent prior to returning to Ithaca to resume graduate studies. This encounter suggests something of the cultural differences that separated the Ferry and Hooker families at the time. By the 1890s, the Ferry family were well-established boosters of Detroit, where they plied the international seed market. From their not insubstantial means, Mr. Ferry cultivated a growing interest in fine art. Elon and Blanche eventually married in 1901, settling down in the greater New York City area, between a residence in New York City and a growing estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, christened Chelmsford, after one of Thomas Hooker's English parishes. Elon conceived and managed his growing business. As Hooker Electrochemical grew, so did Chelmsford, with its sylvan forests, cut through by placid streams, and enlivened by gardens designed by Mrs. Hooker. These gardens provide yet another clue as to the importance of aesthetics that Blanche Hooker brought from her own upbringing under the fatherly gaze of Dexter Ferry Sr., America's garden and flower seed king. Elon Hooker was an unusually well-educated and enterprising businessman who championed progressive age reforms in the workplace and society. He gave a number of speeches off the stump as a friend and campaign treasurer of the Bull Moose candidate Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. Hooker expressed strong views on immigration reform, which he supported, and improved labor relations. Blanche's attention to the arts and Elon's public-minded persona played significant roles in shaping Blanchette's coming of age. Letters convey his affection for his girls, one memorably pinned to Blanchette on his 60th birthday, soon after she had enrolled at Vassar. Quote, 60 years ago today, I was born in the North St. Paul Street home of my grandfather, Elon Huntington of Rochester. It seems inconceivable that so many years have passed and so quickly, and have still left me feeling in body and spirit so like one of your own generation. Your mother's beauty and her surpassing charm and character have joined with the gracious and stimulating companionship of you girls in keeping me young. Blanchette, like her mother and father, attached high importance to education. This is evident in the meticulous class notes from Blanchette's coursework at Vassar, as well as in her theme papers, which give an early glimpse into her artistic interests. Blanchette gave some sense of her devotion to piano in an American Academy of Arts interview in the early 1970s. But here in her work are essays on the works of Wagner. In the realm of literature, she gravitated towards the Romantics, writing a senior paper on the role of daemons in the poetry of William Wordsworth. It is those yearnings for purposeful creativity that in later years likely sparked her interest in the visual arts and civic engagement. If the portrait of Blanchette looks rather traditional, it also illuminates more contemporary concerns of the historian as her life shifted from coming of age to adulthood and marriage to John III. There is something of a social and cultural history of the elite in an inventory of their household possessions for the years immediately after their marriage, taken after a break-in at the residential complex where they lived early on in New York City. The art, the books, the accoutrement of their early life together reveals touches of home that they both brought to the marriage. Here, a Japanese screen to partition a bedroom, a possession of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller loaned to the newlyweds. There, in the library, some German language books, representative of Blanchette's interests in fin de siècle, Wagnerian culture. Ultimately, Blanchette's relationship with her husband lies at the heart of her life and her contributions. Like any other couple, they had personal preferences and idiosyncrasies. None more stunning than the floor plans of Blanchette's Manhattan-based art studio house designed by a young Philip Johnson in the 1940s, where she often sat alone to look at works of modern art or gather friends to discuss questions of aesthetics. Notwithstanding their individual tastes, they collaborated on personal and philanthropic interests throughout the course of their married life. This began early on in their joint planning of a country estate, Fieldwood Farm, located outside of the Rockefeller estate in Westchester County, New York. It is difficult to discern Blanchette's point of view on their early journeys together, because when they traveled, she generally relied on her husband's very devoted diary keeping to keep track of their experiences. But the correspondence from the estate's construction addresses both John and Blanchette's individual tastes. This healthy interplay of complementary interests later enhanced their ability to collaborate on building Asian and American art collections. Asia stands at the center of the couple's shared interests. John's involvement with the Japanese Peace Commission is well documented, but less is known about the crucial role Blanchette played as a cultural courier between Japan and the United States in the early 1950s. In the aftermath of her first trip to Tokyo in 1951, where she dashed about the city while John remained captive during diplomatic negotiations, it was she that took the initial steps to have a tea garden built in the MoMA court for several years in the early 1950s, before its permanent relocation, where it can still be seen today, in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. But the distinction of who took initiative to introduce another form of Asian culture to an America not too far removed from the Second World War obscures the overwhelmingly collaborative nature of their cultural affinity for Asia. While John delineated social programs to ease population pressures throughout the continent, Blanchette commuted to Columbia University to study Asian history with leading scholars of the age, including Japanologist Sir George Sampson. This midlife return to the classroom lasted 3 years, during which time she completed the coursework with copious notes and term papers as proof for a master's degree. Annual trips to Asia, where she applied her newly found knowledge, precluded composition of a thesis. From this marriage of complementary interests, Blanchette and John pooled their knowledge and resources to create the Asia Society, which promoted appreciation of contemporary issues and cultural accomplishments throughout the continent, as well as the John D Rockefeller III Fund, now managed by the Asian Cultural Council, which uniquely supported the preservation of Asia's material and performance-based cultural heritage. The Asia Society papers exclusive to Blanchette document her full attention to its perpetuation in the wake of John's untimely passing in 1978. Blanchette's life reflects that of a woman who not only shared her husband's interests, but as they aged, felt quite at home with the Rockefeller family. Following the death of John III, Blanchette turned and found immediate refuge in her brother-in-law's David's home. As the anecdote at the outset of this talk suggests, Blanchette and David carried on a warm professional relationship as their respective roles at the MoMA expanded in the late 20th century. At the same time, Blanchette's friendship with Mary Todd Clark Rockefeller, former wife of Nelson Rockefeller, blossomed. Meaningful expressions of support and affection brighten their personal correspondence. Remarkably, we catch glimpses of Mary that are difficult to discern elsewhere in the family's extended papers. At the same time, Blanchette threw herself ever more purposefully into creating opportunities for appreciating the arts. Her MoMA files attest to her dignified persistence in cultivating trustees and reliable donors in a new age of uncertainty for private museums in the early 1980s. At the same time, she supplemented her practical experience of presiding over the MoMA with increased outreach to national organizations affiliated with museum management. Finally, Blanchette quietly entered the political realm, urging select senators and congressmen to support public initiatives in the humanities. The dedication of the Blanchette H. Rockefeller Gallery, 3 years after the museum's reopening in 1984, marked the pinnacle of her service to the institution. As her professional obligations receded into the past, she gained international distinction, repatriating Russian icons to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. In her final years, beginning as early as 1984, according to family accounts at her memorial service, Blanchette bravely fought against the advancing effects of Alzheimer's disease, a struggle for which she deserves admiration. It is only for family members to know its private effects, but surprisingly, she continued to sustain the vibrant network of social relations that in so many ways defined the magnanimity for which she was so well known publicly. Let me just share an example of that as we close here. The longest running set of correspondence in Blanchette's collection spans 4 decades and records her friendship with Misao Matsumoto, the daughter of her husband's collaborator at the International House in Tokyo. Misao came to the United States as an undergraduate transfer to Vassar College in 1955, where she studied alongside Sandra Rockefeller. Misao took a degree in childhood education and returned to Japan, where she married now renowned architect Fumihiko Maki, whose recent creation, 4 World Trade Center, today graces the lower Manhattan skyline. Misao remained in contact with Blanchette until the end of Blanchette's life. It should be noted, however, that Blanchette hosted a dinner for the pair on the occasion of Fumihiko receiving the Thomas Jefferson Award in Architecture from the University of Virginia in February of 1990. Said another way, the archives suggest that life in the late stages still held meaningful moments as Blanchette approached the end of a remarkable journey. More importantly, she made important decisions during the 1980s that burnished the institutional jewels of her and John III's making, including the Asia Society, the International House of Japan, and completion of the disposition of John's American art collection to the San Francisco Museum of Art. Further proofs of Blanchette Rockefeller's aesthetic and civic legacy lies some 80 miles north of Fieldwood Farm. There, at Vassar College, Echoes of her Hooker and Ferry family history resonate with the world she forged in marriage with John III. Take, for instance, the Alumna Guest House, which her mother and Aunt Queen funded in the mid-1920s. On campus, one can walk into the sturdy, Norman-esque chapel that flanks the entry gates to campus, where Elon and Blanche Hooker would have heard a Rockefeller, Franklin in this case, not the more familiar Theodore, speak at Blanchette's college graduation in 1931. But it is in the art museum that we find a fitting symbol of Blanchette's legacy. Blanchette and her mother donated a number of works to the museum. There is, for example, Jean-Léon Gérôme's Camels at the Watering Place, which once graced the walls of Dexter Ferry Sr.'s home in Detroit before its gifting to Vassar on behalf of Blanche Ferry Hooker in 1908. But it is in the final gallery space, before exiting, that we find the Ukrainian-born American Louise Nevelson's white-painted wooden creation, Don's Wedding Feast column, which was donated by Blanchette to the museum in 1969. The two tapering vertical columns, each delicately constructed of asymmetrical planks of white wood, symbolize the complementary roles played by the Hooker and Rockefeller families in shaping Blanchette and her husband John's contribution to the world of art in the late 20th century. Likewise, Blanchette's background epitomizes the story of complementary influences that produced an extraordinary life. An upstart industrialist, her father, crossed paths in Rome with the heiress of the Ferry Morris seed empire, her mother, which set the stage for Blanchette's disciplined upbringing in a world filled with art and a family of connoisseurs who had a public-minded mission to spread the benefits of education democratically. Her marriage to John Rockefeller III picked up where her single life had ended. She embraced a mother-in-law who shared her own family's interest in art, even the avant-garde school of the day, as well as a commitment to educate the public through an institution different in size, but not totally in degree from the Detroit Institute of Arts. Her marriage to John brought her literally to new worlds in Asia that she might not have considered had she not become a Rockefeller. Ultimately, those midlife encounters with art and Asia set the stage for a legacy of civic service in the name of beauty, which continues to grow to this day just off Manhattan's Fifth Avenue on 53rd Street. I'd also like to thank the Rockefeller Archives for use of these photos of Blanchette and the Women's Research Initiative grant that funded this research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. What's happening now is that Rachel Bell and Joey Shepard will respond to Dr. Ward's presentation, and then Allie Berg will lead the Q&A. So first Rachel, then Joey, then Allie.
Can everybody hear me? I'm going to talk, so hopefully everyone can hear me. First, we would just like to thank Dr. Ward for his willingness to share his remarks with us today on the fascinating life and contributions of Blanchette Rockefeller. By analyzing women of the past, we can better prepare ourselves for the future, especially amidst such an uncertain time. This is a difficult time as students and faculty at BYU, and we acknowledge the effort that has been made in order to further educate us on the impacts of such an influential, educated woman despite the circumstances. The life, relationships, and choices of Blanchette Rockefeller are far-reaching and exemplary. Through Dr. Ward's analysis, we can better understand who Blanchette Rockefeller was and how she contributed to art, culture, and learning for so many people. Joey will elaborate on this.
The potential we have as individuals is rendered more accessible by looking to Blanchette's example. She persisted and impacted countless individuals using her creativity, initiative, and resources. The intersection of community, art, and gender have all been better understood through the research surrounding her life. Through the presentation today, we have been given valuable information from the past to help broaden and navigate our own lives today, which we will further discuss. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Please join me in giving Dr. Ward another round of applause.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ward, for that excellent presentation. Just as a reminder, please use the group chat feature on Zoom to submit questions, and I will read them aloud, but I'm going to start off the Q&A asking my own question. So, Dr. Ward, this life of Blanchette is so interesting, and she really was such an influential lady. I'm curious to know how you came across her work and what interested you so much in this particular family, and Blanchette especially.
No, thanks for that question. I've done research on the Rockefeller family on 4 different occasions at the Rockefeller Archive Center. That's actually where my interest in tourism developed early in my career. The 3rd generation of Rockefeller brothers were influential in building hotels throughout Latin America, and I was fascinated by the educational dimension of their travels after I looked initially into their work in tourism development. That took me back to the Rockefeller Archives in 2011, where I started studying the travels of John D. Rockefeller III, who became, for all intents and purposes, one of the first, we might say, sponsors of non-governmental educational institutions in the post-World War II world. And I began to wonder as I read through all of the diaries, he was a copious diary keeper, what his wife thought about all of this, because they often traveled together. And so one afternoon when I was tired of reading through different accounts in the summer of 2010, I thumbed through Blanchette's index and found a talk that she had given to a women's group in the 1970s about the influence of her travels on her own life. That's when I learned that she'd returned back to college, to Columbia in midlife to theoretically pursue a study of Asia and Asian art. And I saw also from her own comments how these experiences deeply impacted her on an aesthetic level. As I started researching the lives of travel companions, my quest became to understand Blanchette's contributions to the institutions that had nominally carried her husband's name and influence for so long. And that's what took me back in 2017 to look primarily at her records.
What an interesting story. We are so glad you researched her because she is quite an incredible lady. We have a question here from Rachel. She says, when did Blanchette's love of art begin, and did she know any abstract expressionists personally?
You know what? As I gave my talk, I wanted to do some asides, and this is the main one. My talk today might have sounded like a family history of elites, and that's partially by design, because when you're doing research on someone that marries into a prominent family, you need to establish their identity on their own to properly understand the scope of their contributions, that they're integral individuals apart from whatever umbrella they walk beneath for the rest of their lives. And the point that I would make here that I think is so consequential is that Blanche's mother's family was interested in modern art before the Rockefellers. And so while Abby Aldrich, who was the wife of John D. Rockefeller II and the mother of John D. Rockefeller III, is often heralded as rightly so, one of the patrons of modern art in New York, Blanchette came from a family equally interested in art in Detroit. And what I would encourage all of you to do once coronavirus has passed is to go and see the institution that her grandfather built, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and see the living legacy of modern art there that is equally as poignant to what you'll see at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's without question that Blanchette knew many of these artists whose works she collected. I can't pick out any by name, but what I will say in terms of architects, she did know Philip Johnson, who is responsible for some of the most stunning postmodern architecture in New York City. And she really gave him his first commission. She had this just beautifully unique, it was almost like a sitting room in the middle of Manhattan where she could go. There was a small bedroom, but then a large gathering area where she could meet with friends and just look and talk about art. Her husband actually detested modern art. He collected more traditional American art, which is a great, I think, lesson in their what I call complementarity. They both had a love of art, but she had an eye for talent, and in singling out Philip Johnson, helped launch one of the great careers in 20th century architecture that we know of today.
All right. We have another question here from Dawn. She says, were Blanchette's efforts unprecedented or unusual for her time? And how were her efforts significant or different from those others people that lived in the same time period as she did?
Great question. So, as I mentioned, Blanchette was president of the Museum of Modern Art on 2 occasions. The first time in 1959 to 1962, she was something of a placeholder because I think it was Nelson could not serve as president of the museum. There was some desire for someone else to be named president, but she had some experience in launching international programs for the Museum of Modern Art. This is another chapter of her life that I wish we could explore. She helped pioneer something called the International Council. And what they would do would be loan out works of art to embassies and make visits to prominent museums around the world and loan art from the Museum of Modern Art, including places like the Tate in London. In that way, she was a tremendous pioneer. And she did that work in the 1950s, which led in part to her naming as the president from 1959 to 1962. Really, I think what distinguishes her from the other presidents of the Museum of Modern Art, men or women, I like to make this distinction. We look for lives of excellence, and we celebrate those lives as singular. And Blanchette's influence on MoMA was singular. among the men or women that led the museum. From 1972 to 1985, she was put in charge of expanding MoMA basically by a third. So if you go there on a Friday night now, when it's free, when Uniglow sponsors Free Friday Night at the Museum of Modern Art, it's very likely that some of the galleries you're looking in were the ones that she helped raise money to add. She also did something very, very innovative that's impacted the history of architecture in New York City. The 1980s were a difficult time for large museums. Corporate donors were becoming more reluctant to put forth the type of money that was necessary for works of art that were now selling in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. Imagine that many of the works of art that you see in museums have a value higher than the building that they're in themselves. So this is back in the 70s, and she helps to hatch and realize a scheme wherein the Museum of Modern Art would sell the air rights above MoMA to owners of condominiums that would be housed in a residential tower. And the profits from that residential tower would perpetually feed into funding, maintenance, and acquisitions for the Museum of Modern Art. If you don't think that is extraordinary, they just launched a taller tower, I think, last year. And this idea of selling air rights for residential construction is also responsible for the building boom right now on the edge of Central Park, where you have these really tall, slender residential towers that are becoming the hallmark of the 21st century skyline of New York. So Blanchette's legacy that is unusual and singular. One is in the starting of the International Council, which would be a talk for another day. Just remarkable in expanding educational opportunities for Americans in art institutes abroad, and also loaning out works of art to international museums. And then her work from 1972 to 1985 was not as a wallflower. She's recognized as setting a paradigm for revenue generation with the residential tower project, as well as its expansion, which most people don't recognize when they cross those thresholds on 53rd Avenue today. Those are great questions.
Perfect. We have another question. This one is from Allison. It says, you mentioned that she preferred art with a purpose. What purpose did she feel connected to regarding the modern art of her time? And what do you feel she liked about it?
That's a fantastic question. I wish I could go back to the slides that I showed. There's one I took in her gallery, and it's a Barnett Newman portrait. It's largely red, and there's a couple with their arms around each other's back, and they're just pondering. I don't know what they're thinking about, but Blanchette, I think, found aesthetic serenity and wellness in abstract expressionism. And this is one of the great purposes of modern art that stretches back to its points of origin. Let's see here. We can go, I think it's the second or third slide. I think it's the fourth slide, actually. Sorry, there we go. So that's a iPhone 5 in Blanchette Rockefeller's gallery, and there's a real practical purpose there with that art. I don't know her familiarity with a Russian abstract artist named Vasily Kandinsky, but Kandinsky believed that there was a therapeutic quality of art that could be conveyed to patrons of the arts and those that appreciated the arts. And I have a sense that this is what Blanchette also saw. She also had a very strong passion for opening museums to larger and larger audiences. That's what I mean by that she saw democratic promotion of the arts, and this is something else that she was celebrated for doing. And so I think those would be the two purposes. One, that art has a therapeutic impact, and second, that this was a gift that should be enjoyed by a broader swath of humanity.
All right. Wow. I do have another question for you. This is from Dawn. She says, you mentioned Blanchette's marriage was central to her life and experience. How can we similarly allow our relationships with others to widen our perspectives and appreciation for culture and other aspects of life?
Well, there's a couple answers I would have here, and I don't purport to give people advice on relationships, but Blanchette remained an integral person. She brought her love of art to a family that had a similar interest, but that had different trajectories. And she was not bashful about remaining true to what she personally loved. As I mentioned, her husband had much more traditional artistic tastes, but they would go on art buying sprees, maybe like I go on used book buying sprees, comparable amounts of money on the two levels. But they would help each other in those endeavors. The greatest compliment I can give to Blanchette is that she was true to her relationships while remaining true to herself. She saw as her path forward once her husband died in perpetuating his legacy, which included disposition of his American art collection to the San Francisco Museum of Art. But she was also recognized for choosing those elements that she felt were most important. And if you're interested in Blanchette, and you really won't find much mention of her, I'd encourage you to look up the website for the Asia Society. There are some people that claim she had more to do with that than even John did. I don't think it matters who gets the credit. But today, the Asia Society is one of the leading private institutions that watches the diffusion of culture in Asia around the world. You can look up their feed on YouTube. They sponsor scholarly talks. They now have branches in all parts of Asia as well as New York. And it's a lovely little art gallery that you can visit on Park Avenue should you have a chance to go there. And I think the serene spirit of the Asia Society is a reflection of Blanchette. And again, how she remained loyal to someone she loved, but then was not reluctant to choose the aspects of their legacy that she felt were the most important.
All right, we have another question related to the Asian Society. Marin says, how did the Rockefellers' interest in Asian art translate into philanthropy towards Asian peoples and Asian Americans?
Well, this is another great question where we have to disentangle the threads of families and generations. So, John D. Rockefeller III's father, who we can call Junior, he initiated philanthropic efforts in Asia, even while his son, who would become Blanchette's husband, was in college. So if you visit the Forbidden City, again, after coronavirus has passed, they were the first to endow funds for the preservation of the Forbidden City. And that's kind of a traditional type of philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller III, it took several years for him to kind of find his way in the family. What am I going to do in the family? And he was given the opportunity after he graduated from college, and this is really ironic. His father really didn't want him to, quote unquote, waste his time traveling around the world after he graduated from Princeton. But he relented, and John D. III traveled around the world in 1928 and 29. And that's when he gained a deeper appreciation for the social problems as well as the aesthetic heights of Asian society. His initial interest as a young newlywed with Blanchette was actually in social problems. And he was very active in trying to, he funded the creation of a Japan international house in Japan and in India that brought scholars from around the world to bring their attention to bear on sociological questions in Asia, really forward thinking in this aspect of philanthropy. And it was Blanchette, I would say, that really began to turn his attention to art. Her family had not been as deeply, they didn't have as deep pockets, but did not have the international reach in philanthropy that his did. But their shared interest in the region influenced the multifaceted approach of Asia Society, for example. So if you go to Asia Society today, on a Friday night, you can catch a film about Buddhism in their screening room. You can go downstairs to the bookstore and buy books on art, on sociological, urban issues in Asia. I think Asia Society is a microcosm of their joint interests in Asia itself and their perpetuation of interest in Asia beyond John D. Rockefeller II Jr.'s artistic endeavors to preserve the Forbidden City.
Wow. Okay, we have just about 2 minutes left, so we have one more question for you, Dr. Ward. This one comes from Francesca. She says, how do you think Blanchette's legacy has inspired other women to enter realms they typically wouldn't be welcomed into?
I think it rests on the merits of what she did. And that's what I would like to promote with my scholarship of her. So she gained this interest in Asia in midlife. She wasn't a putterer. She wasn't a dilettante. What did she do? She enrolled at Columbia in graduate classes. And you ought to read some of these are great research papers. It's one of the things that I really prize is looking at the education of Mrs. Rockefeller. She had a formal education in Asian art and Asian studies, and then she complemented this with attending conferences like professors do on museum administration. It was picking something up in midlife and building upon it as a lifelong learner that to me are most inspiring, and I hope that it will inspire young women of all ages. I think that's the best way to say it, because she continued to see herself as always growing, always learning.
What an amazing legacy. That is all the time we have. So unmute your mics one more time and give one last round of applause for Dr. Ward. Thank you so much for being with us.